Van Fleet's line. Lincoln, 5 mil north of Seoul, was where the Chinese offensive finally ran out of punch. It was a defensive position right out of World War I, with deep trenches, bunkers, and heavy field fortifications protected by minefields and barbed wire. The Chinese attackers, whose logistics tail was well overextended, couldn't make a dent in it with the enemy on their knees. The hard-fighting 8th Army was preparing yet another offensive, but as of mine, they want your ass down, division hack. First, Sergeant Flemings remarked as he walked into the 3rd platoon, CP looks like you're going to be commissioned whether you like it or not. Top, you know, I don't want to be a lieutenant. I replied, tell that to the boys at division. It was not a new conversation. In fact, it was one I'd had as far back as trust with Captain Eggleston when he'd recommended me for officer candidate school. Luckily or unluckily, depending on how you looked at the war, Korea had broken out before my OCS order came through, and I'd been spared the ordeal with Sergeant Flemings here in George. We'd been going over the same turf for the last 2 months. The only difference was that our discussion, which had been more or less hypothetical, was now a full-blown reality. Soon after IID returned from the hospital in March, Phil Gilchrist had recommended me for a battlefield commission. He had taken the case to Captain Mickey, who approved the promotion then on to Colonel Cork, who only recently had taken command of the 2nd Battalion. The criterion for a battlefield commission was simply to be a proven combat leader. Education, family connections, even officer potential played little part. It was an honour W only on the battlefield, its recipients the spirited frontline fighters who got the job done, and could inspire their fellow troopers to do the same in 10 months of Korean combat. Only 8 men in the 27th Infantry Regiment had been commissioned in the field. Most of them were dead, the price paid for being a Mustang, as the Marine Corps called their battlefield commissions for never being reluctant to stand up in charge. When the chips were down was often one's own life, in truth. I felt honoured to be considered worthy of inclusion among this distinguished group of warriors. But there was one problem. I didn't want to be an officer. Being an officer didn't jive with my childhood expectations of army life or with the reality of my 7th grade education and trust. I'd had so little self-confidence that the only thing I was sure of in terms of my ability to handle OCS was that I'd flunk out the first day. Now, having been a non-com for more than 2 years, I'd concluded that I was an NCO through and through, and there seemed little reason for jumping into the officer ranks. I don't want to be like all those 90-day wonders, Sergeant Flemings, I pleaded with. The top kick referring to OCS graduates. They don't show me anything. I want to be a platoon sergeant, like I am now, and just run my platoon. Then one day maybe be a master sergeant. I'll be happy as Larry when I've got 3 stripes up and 3 stripes down. I don't want to be a lieutenant, as a board of officers reported to the commanding general of the European theatre at the end of World War II on the battlefield. If a platoon sergeant whose platoon commander has just been killed can successfully lead 50 scared, confused men who depend on him for everything, and who must be made to accomplish what they think is impossible. It is of no consequence if the AGC Army General Classification test score of that man is less than 100, and he never attended high school. The first sergeant had a point, and besides, he'd been there and done it all while I'd just been dreaming about it. He was a from here to eternity NCO and straight as a die. Flemings knew the score, and I knew he was right this time when it counted. He'd worn me down. "Okay," Top said, "you got a deal. If I can keep my platoon." The paperwork was done at Division Rear, 150 miles to the south, near Tew. The Adjutant General Lieutenant Colonel Master put me in a tent where casual slept I stretched my fart sack out on. The dirt floor, and marvelled at the luxury of my plush quarters, electric lights no less. I went to be processed, which meant closing out my old records and opening up new officers' ones. And the next day, by the direction of the President, the AG swore me in. He pinned a 2nd lieutenant's bar on my right lapel, and then asked me where my cross-rifle infantry insignia was. I didn't have one, as it turned out, neither did he. So he pinned another brass bar on my left lapel, which is how they're worn in the US Navy, and said, "Well, that's it. Lieutenant, congratulations, report to division forward soonest. How do I get there?" I asked him, "As you figure it out, Lieutenant." I hadn't told the guys I was sharing the tent with that I was there to be commissioned, so when I went back to collect my trusty M1 and my gear, they all thought it was quite amusing that I was now an officer, and a naval officer at that. I was pretty embarrassed by the whole thing, especially because I didn't feel any different at all. I'd sort of thought something would happen. I didn't know what. But something and nothing did. I was still Sergeant Hackworth with bars, 2 to be exact. I went to the road and put out my thumb. A truck picked me up, and for the first time in my life someone called me sir. The driver said, "Where are you going, sir?" I told him north, and that I'd been a sergeant up until a few minutes ago, so don't call me sir. "Yes, sir," he replied, and we roared down the road at division forward. I met another wolfhound who'd just been commissioned, Lieutenant Ushida from C Company, 1st Bat. Ushida was an old guy of at least 27 who'd served with the Fame, the regimental combat team in World War II, fighting his way through Italy, Normandy, and across Europe. I'd always admired the unit. It was just a great fighting team, and with 31% casualties had won more Purple Hearts than any other regiment, as well as more than 18,000 individual awards and 7 distinguished unit citations. So I guess it was only natural that I admired USA too. We spent the day together, I pumped him for war stories, and in the course of it all really became close to him. That night, after the division briefing, there was a little ceremony, USA, and I stood up, and Brigadier General J. Sladen Bradley, who'd recently taken over the 25th Division from General William Keane, pinned on our bars. Bradley was a fine fighting general himself, and now he gave us a quiet speech, making no bones about his belief that we as battlefield commissions as Mustangs were among a rare breed of fighting men. With that I said goodbye to Lieutenant USA with the hope that someday we'd tie in on the line or something, but it was not to be. And when I heard he was killed in combat soon after we were commissioned, a fate this good man shared with the majority of the 27th Battlefield Commissions, most of whom did not survive the war, it knocked me for one very serious loop. I reported into 2nd Battalion HQ for what was to be my first eyeball-to-eyeball with our new battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Cork. I'd heard little good about him in the month or so he'd been with the unit from the scuttlebutt. It seemed that 2nd Bat would have gone to hell in a high-speed handbasket had it not been for our S3 Battalion Operations Officer, Captain Mealy, who more or less ran the battalion not just in late April during the Chinese Spring Offensive, but every day of the week. On first impression, Cork was not my kind of soldier. He was drunk or well on his way. When I reported in at midday, he slurred out that I was going to Easy Company. I protested, telling him I was from George, and that the first sergeant had said I'd return to my unit. Well, George Company's first sergeant doesn't run this battalion, does. Cork asked, "The first sergeant is far more capable of running this battalion than you'll ever be, you drunk, silly-looking son of a," I thought to myself, but kept my mouth shut. "You're assigned to Easy Company." "Dismissed," mumbled Cork, and then something more about not getting myself killed. It was the middle of the night. By the time I found Easy Company's trains there, I met first Sergeant Cox, a good man who'd been with the Wolfhounds as far back as Japan. He was a real pro, a fine soldier who helped me one hell of a lot until I got the hang of this platoon leader business. I was a little afraid of it, despite the fact that I'd been doing the job in one way or another on and off since Italy. Now Cox said the battalion was online, E Company was up forward, and since I was eager to get cracking, why didn't I take up the resupply trains? It was a reasonable suggestion, and off we went into the pitch black. KN. No one really knew where we were going. Least of all, me. We didn't know exactly where the front was, and before long we didn't even know where we were. Damn, I thought if Cox had known what a rotten ground navigator I was, he'd never have given me this job, but he had. And on we went, me a few troopers and 15 Korean labourers loaded down with more than twice their weight in ammo, water, and other supplies. The Korean labourers were the third tier of Korean nationals involved in the war, under the offices of the ETH Army, the Republic of Korea R Army, and the Korean Augmentation Troops. US Army CAT SAS were the other two. The Arrow had disintegrated in the first moments of battle almost 11 months ago, when the North Koreans invaded the South. Since then, they'd reformed, gotten into fighting shape, and now fought side by side with units of the United Nations forces. The Katusa origins were the beginnings of the war itself, when Syngman, Re-President of South Korea, declared a state of emergency and initiated a draft. About 100,000 young men were rounded up both to train and to be kept out of North Korean hands. When the time came to farm them out to Iraq units, it became apparent that a huge surplus of replacement troops existed. Someone then had the idea to integrate these soldiers into the US units, which had arrived in country with only 2 under-strength battalions per regiment, and before long the augmentation occurred. Unfortunately, most of these Kusas were not worth nothing, as fighters for them bugging out was the rule, not the exception, but it really wasn't their fault. They had no understanding of the English language, and US infantry guys on the ground knew no Korean, as Captain M explained the Katusa problem. Best, how could they have full faith in somebody they couldn't even talk to? Still, the Kusas came and stayed until they bugged or were wounded or killed. They generally worked in pairs with the survivors, normally ending up as ammo bearers for their units. Communication was just one of the problems between Korean and US troops. Ethnic customs and religious beliefs were often miles apart in the two cultures, and little or no effort was made to bridge the gap. One crisis that occurred among the labourers in our battalion began when, for morale purposes, it was decided Lion White, the code name for 2nd Bat 27th, needed a new battalion sign. Design ideas went back and forth, and the one finally chosen and executed included a human skull, which was perched on top of the sign itself. By the next day, all the Korean chogi bearers had disappeared. Captain M went out to find them. The labourers were well down the road to the south. By the time he caught up, when he asked why they'd left, they replied it was because of the sign with the skull. They said they just couldn't work for people who had so little regard for human beings as to do something like that. Michael had to promise he'd have the skull removed, and that it and its body would receive a decent burial before they said they'd come back. All of us may have become jaded enough to think the sign was a real masterpiece, but to the poor Koreans our attitude was simply barbaric. But the chogi bearers did come back, and the 15 with me now just smiled and strained and trudged along as we stumbled around in no man's land looking for easy company. We heard movement. I hid the noisy carrying party in a drawer, went off with one of the guys to have a look. CM1's at the ready. Within moments we made contact with an element of easy company on their way back from a patrol. The chance encounter scared the hell out of them. PFC Red Smalling, a freckle-faced kid and brilliant combat soldier from Arkansas, who'd walk up and down the line at night, making sure the guy on guard were all awake. If one wasn't Smalling, would hold his .45 against the side of the transgressor head and fire off round. And as if that wasn't enough to wake the kid up and teach him a lesson the next day, Red would follow him to chow and beat the crap out of him, with the first sergeant making sure the fight wasn't broken up until Red had done a good job. This particular routine was explained to me by weapons squad leader Bobby Stokes, who also introduced me to the machine gun duo of John Lipka and Richard Sovereign, 2 gunners who knew their weapons. As well as a guy knows every curve of the body of his first great love, they practiced night and day and had downpad a Chevy in a haircut 2-bits duet, which they'd play on the machine guns during enemy attacks, so Bobby would know their positions hadn't been overrun. It was a brilliant idea, and it worked. There were also some great characters among the officer corps in our Haven Likey Reserve. The character of characters was one, Lieutenant Milo David Rowell, a West Pointer class of 1950 and commander of the track platoon collocating with us. Milo was from a wealthy California family and was the heir apparent to the family fortune. We were all less than impressed. We basically considered Milo an outsider. He wasn't infantry for openers, and all of E's officers thought he was a pampered prude, and though we'd never say so to his face, we managed to let him know how we felt by ganging up on him when the officers got together to play hearts. The way we did, it was by making sure Milo got the Queen of Spades in every single heart. Except one, we'd set it up in such a way that he thought he was going to shoot the moon. He'd get all excited, and then he'd lose with 25 big points. All of us took almost sadistic pleasure in this, because then Milo would throw tantrums. We inferior infantry morons were ganging up on him. Not fair. Not cricket one night, after he got his usual shaft. He blew up, he threw down his cards, jumped up from the makeshift table and yelled, "You guys are a bunch of cheaters. I'm never playing with you again." He stormed away. never to return. I think we'd been playing for a penny a point. The funny thing about this was that we'd really been living the good life during our reserve duty. The work wasn't hard. There was plenty of time for laying back in the warm spring sun. We lived in liberated Korean huts, and we were eating the Army's gourmet food line beautiful hotter rations. Milo was so pissed off that he moved his platoon out of our cosy village and lagered them in an open field. He wouldn't even let his guys continue to eat with us, so they slept under ponchos and ate SE rations, while their offended leader fumed. We couldn't help but laugh, despite our feeling sorry for the poor folks in Milo's command. Soon our combined team, designated Task Force Evans, after Del Evans, our company commander, was ordered to pass through the front and probe a series of small Chinese Occupy hills. In preparation for a UN limited offensive, which was jumping off the next day, we breezed out riding the backs of tanks. When we got close to the hills, the infantry dismounted and deployed in a line of skirmishers. Mines, mines, came a sudden, urgent cry. We froze. A quick recon revealed my platoon was in the middle of an American AP minefield full of bouncing Betty types for infantry. The worst in the inventory we carefully reorganized at a respectful distance behind the tanks, and while the Chinesey watched us from the hills well outside effective rifle range, the tanks proceeded to lead us through the held blasting lanes with their tracks. Meanwhile, the enemy started lobbing a few mortar rounds, but never got close, one advantage the Americans always had over the communists in Korea. And thank God, because they'd have eaten us alive, was that the Reds could never quickly and effectively adjust their indirect fire's mortar and artillery, nor with their bad comm easily coordinate fire support once out of. The minefield. We started manoeuvring up the Ridgel line. The tanks and tracks supported our attack with overhead fire from the valley floor. It was standard procedure attacking a hill under an umbrella of fire, except that after a while we were getting rained on the tracks. Quad 50s were chewing up the ground with long bursts right into my people. I screamed on the radio, shut it off, you're firing right on top of us. But the slugs kept coming. I grabbed the air panel, my RTO dragged behind his radio and started waving holy hell out of it. This long, brightly coloured panel would show a blind man, our forward edge, the Quad 50 fire lifted miraculously. We had no casualties. First, US mines. Now us fire. Who needs an enemy? I thought then I remembered who commanded the tracks, and though I did know he hadn't done it purposely for a fleeting moment, I wondered if that friendly fire hadn't just been Milo Rowell's trump card from the map, and from the valley floor too, the ridge had looked as if it ran to the top of the objective assigned to me by Del Evans. But about 400 yards from the top of the hill, we found that it was a military crest to continue the attack. We'd have to move across a long pool table like shelf, and then come back up. There was no cover, no concealment, no avenue of approach. It would have been a picket's charge no more healthy for infantrymen in Korea 1951 than it was at Gettysburg 1863. I held up the guys and called Del with the lowdown. He switched the main attack to 2nd Platoon, commanded by a former NYPD cop, and recalled World War II vet 1st Lieutenant Jim Lynch, which was coming up. Another finger-hour job would now be to support their assault by rifle and machine gun fire. We'd been pinched out of the assault, and for the 3rd of easy, it was a lucky case of being in the wrong place at the right time. 2nd Platoon did not have an easy road. The Chinese were solidly dug in, and were not about to be shoved off their hill. The first part of the mission to determine the enemy's disposition was accomplished. The minute we locked horns, the second part of the mission to inflict maximum casualties on the enemy was also accomplished. All guns and weapons blazing within the company, and supported by tank Quad 50 artillery and co-air delivery bombs, and napalm, still the assault force took casualties. One trooper was blown down the hill and rolled into the pool table in front of my platoon. He lay in the open, right under the Chinese guns, brave Corporal Victor Carris, from my platoon, acting on his own. Quickly stripped his gear and took off like a shot. He grabbed the guy as though he were a bag of potatoes, and charged back through a hail of enemy fire to the safety of our hill's reverse slope. Our doc patched the kid up, and he lived. Carris was later awarded the Silver Star for his act of unselfish gallantry. Still, his feat could have backfired. He could have been hit, and then 2 disabled troopers would have lain exposed on the open fear-swept crest until another brave soldier rushed to the rescue and got hit himself. I'd seen and heard about it 1,000,000 times. A leader has a difficult time preventing such waste. The problem is simply that if enemy fire can cut down 1 man, the same fire can cut down a 100 in a hot firefight. A rifle platoon can take 10 casualties before you can cry medic, and if you multiply by 10 the 1 rifleman who falls out to look after his buddy, suddenly you've lost the guts of the platoon's firepower. So a leader has to be hard-nosed. He must remember his mission comes first, and only then the welfare of his men. If a guy stubbed his toe 3 feet from a cobra, you wouldn't let his buddy sit down, take off the guy's boot, and assess the damage, especially when a deer is lurking just behind the snake. A leader cannot give the enemy the initiative by allowing his unit to become ineffective as a result of care for the wounded becoming first priority. Keep your weapon downrange and don't play medic was my standing operating procedure SOP, and I tried my damnedest to enforce it. Any other course carried not only the risk of failure to accomplish the mission, but also the loss of a hell of a lot more men than necessary. The sun was going down. We were supposed to be home before dark, and having accomplished his mission. Del Evans sent word to break off 3rd Platoon, provided covering fire while the 2nd and 1st broke contact. But the Chinese fire was still so hot that 2nd Platoon's dead could not be gotten out without a still greater cost in lives. Del wisely decided to continue our withdrawal as planned. We'd pick up our Kia in the morning, early the next day. A Turk unit attached to the 25th Division secured the hill as part of the offensive, and I drew the task of recovering our dead. When we got up there, the Turks had completed mopping up, and were now lazing around and smoking in the sun, great fighters. The Turks mean loud and awesome, looking damn near impossible to like, but the kind of soldiers you were generally glad to have on your flank. Interestingly, the Turks felt the same way about the Wolfhounds, according to Fo Alan Bell, who worked with them for a while. The 27th was the only unit the Turks even admitted existed. I found the Turk commander, and he took me to our dead for 4 bodies stacked up neatly wrapped in ponchos. Then he said, "You Americans no can take hill, Turks take hill. We walk up Chinese, say Turks come when we run away. We afraid of Turks. Everybody afraid of Turks. Now, as individual soldiers, the Turks were great. But the reason the Chinese were even on that hill was that the Turks had lost it to them a few days before. Furthermore, our mission had not been to take the hill in the first place. And on top of that, the only reason the Chinese defenders were easy pickings when the Turks took off in the attack was that Easy had blown the hell out of that hill. We'd reduced the position to a pile of rubble the day before, but tell that to the Turks, tell that to this puffed-up dude with the huge mustache. It really wasn't worth the effort. So I just took the broken English. He laid on my unit and hauled ass and bypassed, as it were, the fight to which my protests eventually would have led. The 2nd phase of the Chinese spring offensive was petering out. Now it was the UN forces' turn to attack north. Happily, the Wolfhound 2nd Bat was given a break from the fighting. We went into Corps Reserve at Uij Jongbu. There a tent became the officers' club, and a few nights later Colonel Cork summoned an officers' beer call. My first of such social outings since I'd been commissioned in heart and soul. I was still an NCO after only 2 weeks wearing a bar. Not much more could be expected, so I guess it was only natural for me to be uncomfortable, socially speaking, around officers. For the main, we came from different worlds. I didn't know a dessert spoon from a soup spoon, and because I didn't have an education, I doubt I even knew the difference between a noun and a verb. When one of my first officer efficiency reports, or ERA, stated that I was quiet and unassuming. The raider had been dead right, but only because I was too afraid to open my mouth, so at Cork's party, besides having a few beers and chatting with Del Evans and Phil Gilchrist, who was now Mick's assistant in the Battalion S3 shop. I kept quiet and watched. The whole thing wasn't my scene. Parties never were my conclusion at this one, was that officers' parties were the same as NC's, except that I'd rather be raising hell with the non-coms than playing out this officer and gentleman game. I was about to slip out and return to my platoon when the new Battalion XO called out, "Hackworth, get the Colonel a beer. The Colonel can get his own beer." I replied. It was an immediate reaction, like ducking when someone shouts fire in the hole. I didn't think I'd said it in a loud voice, but it seemed as though everybody in the tent had heard, and now they were waiting for the other shoe to drop in the most deafening silence I'd ever known. Then, quick-thinking Del Evans pulled my arse out of a big crack. He stood up and said, "No, no, Major, not Hackworth. It's Lieutenant Johnson from H Company. He's the junior tenant. He was commissioned a week." After Hackworth Johnson get the Colonel a beer, and Johnson, who'd been an NCO for a long time, but unlike me knew how to move and groove in these circles, jumped up with a big smile on his ruddy Irish face and got the Colonel his beer. Del took me aside. "Hackett's Colonel Cork's policy that the Junior Officer Act is Mr. Vice. It's an old officer custom, goes back to the British Army." "I thought we kicked their ass in 177-78, I retorted. "I ain't getting no beer for no man, Del," I said, because that's where I was coming from, always had and always would. Del put his arm around me. "Come on, I'll walk you back to your platoon. I'm going to have to teach you some social graces, Hack," he said in his rich Arkansas twang, "or start keeping you in a cage." Lieutenant Del Evans was one officer I really liked. He was a small, slight guy, a paratrooper, and a very brave and distinguished soldier. He'd already won a Silver Star and was in for the DSC for an action in February, when he'd been the only man of a 7-man volunteer patrol to reach an objective, still in enemy hands, firing his carbine on full automatic. He'd stormed the hill under some serious automatic weapons, fire and a sky full of grenades, until he'd reached an occupied Chinese hole. Only then did he find he was out of ammo, so he jumped into the hole, swinging his carbine like a baseball bat. The two defenders naturally fought back, and after the carbine stock shattered, Del grabbed the enemy's own potato maher grenades and beat the two Chinese unconscious with them. About that time, he saw 25 or 30 enemy soldiers coming up the hill toward him. Right away, he told me later, I decided if I were going to survive, I'd better learn how to use their grenades. He did, and after he threw about 3, the Chinese reinforcements bugged out. Del gave the two Chinese in his hole one more bash with a potato masher, set a grenade between them, pulled the cord and hauled ass out of the hole. People who watched the incident said he flew out like a bird. The net result of Del's single-handed action was the breakup of a serious counterattack that threatened both the men of his patrol and all of Easy Company. When it was over, he was so shook up over what might have happened that he began to stutter and couldn't stop for 3 days. A funny sidebar to the story was that this incident occurred just 10 days after Easy Company's bayonet charge, and despite Del's gallantry, there was much talk about why he hadn't used his bayonet to finish off the defender's old soldier Colonel Murch, who was still the battalion CEO at the time, even brought the subject up in a note he sent Del along with a bottle of bourbon and a new M2 carbine. The note was attached to the bayonet, and it read, "This carbine and attached bayonet is a token of my appreciation for your today's tremendous act of valor. However, you are reminded that the next time you are expected to use the bayonet, or you will be expected to sign a statement of charges for the misuse of government property." In a word, Del was just a stud of the first order, besides that he was a brilliant gambler, much better than I was, and through shared combat and a lot of money won and lost, he'd become not only my idea of a fine combat officer, but also a most respected teacher and friend one day. Soon after the officer club affair, Del had a visitor to our reserve camp at Uij Jongbu, and rock buddy from college days by the name of Lieutenant Lloyd Leslie Scooter. Burke Scooter. Burke did not look like a big war hero. He was of small build with metal-rimmed glasses. He was Clark Kent, not Superman, but by May 1951 he was well on his way to becoming a legend. In his own time he'd already won a Bronze Star, Silver Star, and in November of '50 the DSC for almost single-handedly stopping a large Chinese force from destroying his LST Cav unit. By the time he'd leave Korea in November 1951, he would earn 3 Purple Hearts in the Medal of Honor too. The latter is Company EXO just about to rotate home when he heard his battalion was in it, deep on the line, and led about 35 men left in his company in a final attack, catching live Chinese grenades. 5 South Korean policemen had for some unknown reason beaten up Big Stoop, Easy Company's #1 Chogi boy. They'd really done a number on the kid, hanging him upside down from a tree and beating him with their rifle butts. Del was outraged, And rightfully so. I was among the 5 volunteers who, in accordance with Dell's wishes, put the cops in the same condition as Big Stoop or worse. This second incident ended up in a sea inquiry, and while the 5 vigilantes got off scot-free, the thing cost Dell dearly. Every time his name came up for a battlefield promotion, it would be crossed out. The lieutenant had shown poor judgment and should have known better. Dell resigned himself to his fate, looking at the event as a lesson for me in the use of power and how it can be abused. I personally believed in the eye for an eye justice. We dished out to those cops who'd abused their power, but was sorry it had cost Dell his tracks. He was only 22 years old, but he damn well deserved them. By the end of May, UN forces in the east were really giving the enemy a run for their money, and now the 25th Division was ready to put the squeeze on the Chinese from the other side. The Wolfhound and Cacti regiments were to lead this assault from the west, jumping through the Duche 4 to attack into the Kuma Valley the day before the operation. The 31st of May, our unit was trucked from Wujianggu down a dry creek bed, which was to serve as our main road Easy Company's assembly area, was a ridge running down behind the front line with the company CP located at the bottom. It was payday, traditionally the peacetime army's day off, that wonderful lazy day once a month when you put aside soldiering for the roll of the dice and the snap of the cards. We were still in reserve, which was as close to peacetime as anything in a war zone, so we whiled away the hours pretending we were in Las Vegas. I'd learned to play poker in Trieste, the same place. I learned the basics of just about everything. I don't know whether I'd read it in a book or seen it in a film, but at some stage early in life I'd concluded that great warriors were usually great poker players. It made sense too, because in many ways the skills required in poker are the same ones you need on the battlefield: boldness, cool head, and the ability to bluff. So it was only natural for me to feel compelled to be the best poker player on the block in Italy on payday. We got paid early in the morning by the officers who'd then go away for the day. The company area would then become our own gambling casino, the recreation room. A makeshift Las Vegas devoted to blackjack, craps, and poker nocos, and enlisted personnel could play. But usually by midnight, only 4 or 5 NCOs would be left. The novices having long before been tapped out after a couple of days or nights. Really more, most all of the company's money would be consolidated. Further between a couple of guys, these two would play the big winners from the other companies, the money being consolidated even more, until finally the big winners of the 3 battalions, each of whom might have $10,000 to play with, would meet at the regimental NCO club for the final playoffs the next day. It wasn't unusual for news to filter down that some guy had won up to $50,000 the night before. Poker is very much a science. You can read as much as you like about it, but you really can't be good at it without playing a hell of a lot. I'd started as soon as I got to Italy, and it took all 4 years I was there to really get it down. At first I'd been limited by finances every month. I was sending $3,750 home to my grandmother in the form of a $50 savings bond, and I couldn't play much poker with the $122 left over from my pay. Like most guys, I sold my cigarettes on the black market, which brought in a couple of hundred more. It was sufficient to get started with at least. At first I'd last about an hour at the table, then 2 or 3, but whenever I got tapped out, I didn't leave. Instead, I'd go to the sharpest guy I saw there, sit down behind him and watch. There were some great players, Sergeant Neal, who was in charge of the Emmys Hall, and Sergeants English Mel Wenny and Randall Johnson, who knew simply from my hanging around that they were teaching me. Sometimes one of them might even show me his hand, and I could see how he played what he played and when, and I would just take the best I could from him. As time passed, I began to stay in the games longer and longer, until by the time I left Trieste in 1950, I was always in the finals, and frequently a big winner. My luck hadn't left me in Korea, except when Del Evans was around, and now waiting to jump off into the Kuma. I was on a bona fide winning streak. We played all day, and one by one all my opponents fell by the wayside at nightfall. We continued by the light of our campfire, but by then it pretty well cleaned out the gamblers, so we decided it was time to quit. I must have won at least $2,000. I didn't bother counting it, just stuffed the loot into my fatigue jacket. Feeling a bit disappointed that I had nowhere to blow it, our platoon CP was in a drawer, and since we hadn't taken any incoming in our area, we hadn't bothered digging in. I'd made the platoon dig for sure, but not the CP. And now that it was dark, it seemed pretty pointless to get carried away scratching out a hole, since we were jumping off first thing in the morning. The rest of my CP group, the Doc RTO Lee Levey Assistant Platoon Sergeant Whitey Snyder and Platoon Sergeant Charlie Greer agreed. So we snapped together our ponchos and made a big lean-to which we hunkered down under solely to keep out the drizzling rain. Soon after we'd settled in, the Chinese artillery got serious blasting all over E Company's position. Then our guns got into the act, and the next thing we knew, a big artillery duel was raging between the good guys and the C bad guys. The only problem was that our lean-to was right in the middle, getting the overs and shorts from both. For some reason, it didn't bother me. The guys were saying, damn, we should dig. And I kept telling them not to worry about it, that we had a great position here in this draw natural protection. I said I could hear the incoming whistle loud and clear in the dark, and it started coming in louder and louder. We flopped onto our bellies and hugged the ground. Greer was next to me. He flung his arm across my back, as the incoming round kept screaming it was going to land right on top of us. I knew it, and it did right at the edge of the goddamn poncho with an ear-splitting roar. Everybody here, anybody here, I asked when. The dust settled and the ringing stopped. The Doc Lee and Whitey all said they were okay. And then Greer said T-hit GRE had just returned from a wound he'd gotten up north. A 50 cal slug had torn through the muscle and tissue of one of his arms, just missing the bone. He had an incredible scar from it, and now the poor guy told me he'd gotten it again. This time in the other arm, the rest of the CP group in the meantime were beginning to sit up, checking out all the places where mud debris and equipment had slammed against them when the round exploded to see if they'd been wounded. Amazingly, Greer was the only one I was still prone, waiting for Greer to move his injured arm when he finally tried. I felt blood and a lot of pain. "Wait a minute," said. "I think I'm hit too." At first we couldn't work out the connection. Then we discovered that Greer's arm was nailed to my back. A shard of shrapnel about 8 in long and half an inch thick had pierced his arm in exactly the same way the bullet had. It had missed the bone, gone the whole way through the muscle and tissue, then out the other side and into my back, if Greer hadn't been such a biggy guy, if he hadn't had such huge arms, and if he hadn't thrown one of them across me, I would have been dead. But as it was, I was alive and kicking with a good wound and a kit full of money. As we PRI Greer's arm off my back, all I could think was Japan. Here I come with great delight. I flipped on my radio and called Dell. I'm hit. Greer's hit and White's taking over. How bad are you guys hit? I think it's pretty bad in the back for me. Greer got it in the arm. We're going down to the aid station now. I'll see you on the way out. Greer and I started down the draw, hindered by thorny bushes and scrub trees growing on the ridge, as well as by the artillery that was still popping all around us. We got to Dell's CP. He was concerned about our wounds and about losing a platoon leader and platoon sergeant just before jump-off. I took his mind off it first of all. I reminded him Whitey had been a World War II combat platoon sergeant, and he could handle the platoon better than Greer, and I put together. And second, I was going to Japan, and I was loaded with dough, so you're not going to get a goddamn cent of it. The thing was, if I hadn't gotten hit, the next big game would have been the playoffs down at Company, and Dell would most likely have cleaned me out. I really rubbed it in, but my poker-playing nemesis wasn't even ruffled. He knew there'd be a next time just before we left the CP. I gave Dell my treasured German Mauser machine pistol. It was a Chinese officer's pistol, a teal prize, and I didn't want it to be knocked off by some rear echelon doc as my Wallam watch had been after the 6th of February. "Look after this, will you?" I asked him for some reason it really mattered. The battalion aid station was overflowing with wounded screw, this thought. We'll wait in line forever. A litter jeep was parked outside, we piled in, and the jeep slowly rocked its way down the creek bed road, much heavier. Chinese artillery was coming in now fast, and furious fires blazed in the darkness. American artillery pieces that had taken direct hits. It was a bad scene. Rounds were smacking all around the jeep, and there we were, well outside the battalion area, travelling about 3m an hour with the headlights off. I told the driver to flip on his lights and make tracks. "No can do." He said we were beyond the light line. I said, "Damn the light line. We're talking about our asses." He flipped on the lights, and we buzzed down the creek bed at a fast clip, leaving all that incoming behind a few miles down the road. An MP stopped the jeep. "Get those lights off, battalion surgeon." I called out. He shot his flashlight at my bar, which I'd pinned onto my steel pot. "Got some critically wounded here. Got to get them out?" "Yes, sir," he said with a smart salute. We tore off. The regimental aid facilities had taken a direct hit. There were wounded everywhere. Some of the medics were in worse shape than their patients. They were brave men, the docs patching people, ignoring their own wounds. An aid man came along. "Where are you hit the back?" I said, "Does it hurt when you breathe?" As a matter of fact, it didn't, but I was glad he asked the question. It was the million-dollar question, which, if I answered correctly, would be my magic ticket to Japan. "Yeah, Doc," I replied a lot. A surgeon came up next, had a look, and asked if it hurt when I breathed. I felt really guilty lying to this guy, because he looked a lot worse off than I did. He'd gotten it in the back too, but I kept thinking of the bright lights of Japan and all this dough I had burning a hole in my pocket. "Oh yeah, Doc, yes, like daggers. Every time I breathed, both Greer and I were evacuated to division clearing. The medic suspected that my left lung was collapsed, and a splinter of shrapnel was still in my back. By this time it was morning, and I was a litter case marked critical. I still hadn't been x-rayed. But again came the million-dollar question, did it hurt when I breathed my response, which was getting better all the time? "It's killing me, Doc. Do you think I'm going to make it?" Got me back to MASH. And from there onto a hospital train back to Pan litters were stacked 3 high on both sides of the crowded ambulance train. The wounded composed a fair slice of the United Nations forces fighting in Korea, Turks, English, French, Greeks. Aussies and Yanks most were non-critical leg, arm and back wounds that didn't require intensive care, which was all for the best because our nurse was a bulldog, no compassion and strictly business. She thumped a needle in my arse and lectured me about staying put lest the shrapnel splinter lacerate my collapsed lung. Further, I moaned and groaned and nodded all the while, keeping my eye on the hot crap game that was roaring in the aisle at the foot of my litter. "You must keep on your left side," she barked. "I want into that game." I thought the minute the Iron Florence Nightingale went on to the next car I was in, kneed deep. I still had $2,000 of 3rd Platoon loot, and with that kind of backing I could almost buy my luck, and I was hot red hot. On one occasion, I made 7 straight passes. The bucks were rolling in US military payment certificates, MPCs, Lire, DRMs, pounds, and francs. My left hand could barely wrap itself around the wad of United Nations funny money I was collecting, as my right hand went on making pass after pass, just as I lost the dice and faded into the crowd. Florence marched back into our car. I slipped back into my litter, and was following orders by the time her sternness came, by trying to ignore the resentful glares of my fellow. Gamblers who'd lost the chance to win back their money, I concentrated on sorting and counting my loot, now close to $4,000, and daydreaming about Japan. The train pulled into the station at Taion, delayed for 4 hours. We were told walking wounded could visit a nearby Red Cross club, but litter patients had to stay on board. But then dear Florence was replaced by a laid-back medical corpsman who, not knowing about my lung condi tan, told me he'd look the other way if you want to stretch your legs. Lieutenant, the army sergeant who ran the train depot, was wearing the wolfhound crest. I hadn't known him. He'd been badly hit, placed on limited duty, and was now a railroad man come over to my place. He offered, got a bottle of Daniels. There, the guy's place turned out to be a railway car that he'd converted into a plush. At least by an infantryman's standards mobile apartment, one corner was stacked with loot. "I take what I need from the supply trains, and a little extra for swapping," he said. "Sure beats climbing hills and getting shot at." I readily agreed, especially as I looked over the fine body of his little Korean mama-san. The railroad man caught my hungry stare. "She's yours, old buddy." He told her he was going out to check my trains, take care of my friend here. And he left the girl, and I cracked open another bottle of whiskey and hopped into the sack. She wasn't much to look at, but I didn't spend a lot of time looking. There's a thing about combat soldiers, and sex on one hand. It's the most important activity in the world on the other. It means nothing at all. Sure, sometimes it was a love thing, but most times it was just a good hard screw. You were looking for girls, one word, and no matter who it was or how it was. That's what it came down to in that all-male, ultra-masculine world of the army. You'd come back from leave. And the first question your buddies would ask was, "Did you get any girls?" "Yeah, it was great." You'd reply, even if you'd struck out best girl I've had in a long time. "I want a girl hold off a soldier's tongue as easily as I want to drink, getting as many girls as you could." Was part of the role. Proving yourself in the cot was as important as proving yourself on the battlefield. Tribal behavior. I guess the great warrior, the great conqueror of all lands and all broads, or some deep psychological thing, knowing you might get killed and wanting to plant the old seed before you went. Or maybe it started in Hollywood. Who knows, who cares? All I know is we talked about a hell of a lot more than we got it. But when we got it, it was pretty damn good. "Train's leaving in 20 minutes, old buddy said. The railroad man, when he returned to find an exhausted, drunk but well-screwed trooper, he walked me to the train. I thanked him for his hospitality. We wolfhounds got to stick together. He said, "Hope you get to Japan. Take care, you hear." I'd known the guy less than a few hours, yet he treated me like a brother. The wolfhounds were a very special fraternity. We said goodbye. I got back on the train, slipped into my litter and dutifully laid down on my left side to take the pressure off my poor, overworked lung. The third station hospital stuck out like a sore thumb in the sand shanty town that surrounded it. What a terrible place for my journey to end. The doc who examined my wound said, "Good news, son, no lung damage. Whatsoever, you'll be back with your unit in no time." It hit me like a death sentence. No lung damage meant no Japan, no land of the rising sun, no place decent to spend my money. It really was a hell of a blow, and the only compensation was my new officer status, which had me living like a king in semi-private luxury. It was an eye-opener, this difference between the officer and soldier worlds. Like a first-class hotel to a Salvation Army flophouse in the enlisted wards, the rows upon rows of crushed bodies were requirements with numbers just to provide basic maintenance. Their nurses had to run around like needle-prodding machines in the officers' wards. A guy's every need was catered to. He was special, and the nurses had time to be human. It was like two different planets. The highlight of my stay, though, was the afternoon. I shared my bed with Jennifer Jones, the movie star who was on a USO tour. Sad to say I was asleep at the time. She sat on my bed, talked to the other guys, and left before I woke up. What a raising I took from my roommate's pan was the __ of the universe, a drab, dirty W-town where the sun didn't shine. The train ticket was open. It was an unstated hospital policy that a Rory could lose himself in the city for a few days. I couldn't stand the place, so I took the next train north, thinking I might hop off and visit my railroad buddy and his girlfriend in Taiyuan before I left. I bought a case of Southern Comfort from a PX sergeant for $50 a bottle. The stuff sold legally for $3, but I didn't care what else was I going to spend my loot on. At least I could get the boys drunk. And besides, they really bought it with their own dough. Gambling money was easy. Come easy, go anyway. It didn't have the same value as the stuff you'd sweated for on the train. I got drunk with a young 187th Airborne squad leader. He had shyly templed dimples, which he'd gotten catching a slug, went in one cheek and right out the other. He said I was hollering at my squad, didn't even know I was hit till I tasted the blood. We toasted his Rakassan paratroopers, and then we toasted the wolfhounds. We even toasted the Chinese and got so drunk that I slept right through town. But goddamn hack, it's good to see you, and especially good to sip a little Comfort Del. Evans said when I got back to Easy he was still the skipper, but his days were numbered. It seemed that his promotion papers to captain had been removed from channels as a result of the UI Zhongbu Big Stoop affair, which meant the first guy with tracks to walk into the battalion would probably be sent to Easy to take over the reins. It was a damn shame, and I got back my Mouser, and we caught up on events. Dell told me the division had been on the attack since the day after I got hit easy, had spearheaded the breakthrough and led the way ever since. Now they were in the 14th day of humping over hill and dale in the Kuma Valley. They'd overrun enough guns and material to equip 2 Chinese divisions, as well as a field hospital. EAS was moving so fast that the new battalion co-Colonel Cork had been relieved, ordered Dell to stop so that his flank units could catch up to hell with slowing up. Dell had responded, "Let them catch us. We're on the enemy's heels. We have to pursue the advantage now." Finally, the CO agreed, as long as Dell sent patrols back during the night to keep contact with the flank units. A 2-mile ordeal for the men assigned this duty. Dell himself was in for another Silver Star on about the 5th day of the action. He discovered a large enemy force to ease rear. At the time, the company's assault elements had been in the middle of some serious hand-to-hand combat, but Dell had successfully disengaged them, gotten his reserve platoon into good blocking positions, and heavy artillery fire onto the Chinese, and brought the enemy to their knees. "The boys did good, Hack," Dell said, smiling, but that had been the high point of the whole 2 weeks. Generally, it had been far less than fun at one stage. He outran its supply tail, and some of the men had been on the verge of mutiny after 3 full days without so much as a SE ration meal, and to top the whole thing off, somehow word had gotten around that Easy was lost somewhere in the valley. So when the guys had reached the hill above their tie-in point with the 89th tank, the tank battalion thought they were enemy and opened free on them. "Now that'll ruin your whole day for you." Dell laughed. Luckily, no one got hurt. I dropped a bottle of booze into the top kick and gave him 6 more to safeguard until 3rd Platoon went into reserve bearing gifts of the remaining 3. I rejoined my unit, Japan or no Japan. It was good to be back. All the old guys gathered at my platoon. CP leaving the replacements to guard the front, we drank down the Comfort, all at one sitting, and told tales of war and railroad stations until darkness broke up our little reunion. We continued attacking north through the Kuma Valley. It was bitching terrain straight up and straight down, with no roads and few trails in our sector. It took 9 hours to pack wounded to battalion, and about the same time to bring up ammo and supplies. It was no fun, with the only redeeming feature being that the Chinese were struggling even more than we were. Enemy resistance was virtually non-existent. Had someone given us the word, we could have marched right on to the Yalu. As it happened, we did get the word, but the message was entirely different from the one we'd expected to hear in late June. After 1 year's hard fighting, the USA Army started digging in deep on some high ground north of the 38th parallel, which we'd recently restored. We built sandbagged bunkers and installed barbed wire barriers with plenty of mines and booby traps. The Chinese were nowhere in sight. If ever there was a time to keep moving, this was it. But the word was stop. There were rumours of peace talks, though, which was good news for everyone. We all shared the hope that we would soon see a ceasefire. All things considered, it was probably for the best that our youthful night prevented us from recognising the enemy's real intention to fuel the peace flame, only to gain time to rebuild its gutted forces. Still, once the heavy field fortification work was over, we started enjoying the sick life until someone remembered that peace talks, or no peace talks. There was still a war going on, and the regiment started vigorously patrolling deep into no man's land. One of 3rd Platoon's first missions was to conduct a combat patrol a few miles in front of our position. An air observer had seen Chinese in a bombed-out village. I stripped the platoon down to 3 lean squads and moved. Out before dawn by first light, we were set up on a small hill a few 100 yards from the reported sightings. We took the enemy by surprise, killing 15 and capturing 4 with no friendly casualties. There was no question in my mind now that the Chinese were on their last legs. Our opponents in the village were sick and hungry, with little will to fight, and seemed more like rear echelon troops. I sent the PS back with a squad. While the rest of us poked around the valley, we found 2 more Chinamen who looked as if they'd been abandoned by their unit. Both were more dead than alive, too weak even to brush away the flies. We pretended we didn't find them. The squad with the PS was still an hour from friendly lines. When we caught up with it, the men had been slowed down by the wounded prisoners. We had instructions to get home before dark. Get back as soon as you can. I told them as the rest of us passed through and hot-footed it back so we could be in our defensive positions by nightfall. Several hours later, the squad joined us. I called company on the field phone. "Where's the old man?" I asked when an unfamiliar voice answered the call. "Lieutenant Evans is checking the line. Okay, listen, the PS are here. I'm sending them to your CP, don't bother," Lieutenant replied. The voice through the wire: "They've got no intelligence value. Battalion has 7 already from the outfit. Just shoot them." "No way. What do you mean?" "No way. Just what I said." No way. All right, Lieutenant. How do you propose we get them to battalion? Then this joker was looking at the PS, not as a human problem, but as a logistics one for weak and wounded PS, a 9-hour walk at night over rough terrain to Battalion Ho. We'd lose at least 4 rifles as escorts. But it wasn't that simple to me. It wasn't even the issue. These were innocent soldiers, unarmed prisoners, and always in my head was the strong belief. But for the grace of God, there go. I said I'm not doing anything till I talk to Lieutenant Evans. He'll figure out something. Meantime, I'll get the prisoners dug in. As I hung up the field phone, I saw one of my guys hanging around the CP door. I didn't know how long he'd been there. He was kind of a weird guy anyway. Never said much and always seemed to be brooding over the problems of the world. The funny thing was, when you put this kid in a battle, he was a tiger, a brilliant, brave combat stud, but the minute it got quiet, he'd revert to being resident weirdo anyway. He was a good man, and I knew I could count on him to organize the PS. I gave him the job, and he shuffled out without a change of expression. A short while later, I headed out of the CP to check 3rd Platoon's positions. I saw Soldier Weirdo overseeing the prisoners. He had them digging in for the night, each with his own little foxhole. I went on down the line, and then out of the blue, I heard gunfire back behind my CP. I ran over to find Soldier Weirdo holding a still-smoking pistol. He'd emptied the magazine into the PS after he'd made each one dig his own grave. They tried to make a break. He explained we never spoke again. The kid had lost me forever, and within a week I got him transferred out, and I was pissed off at whoever that bastard was at the company CP. He was probably laughing now. I knew why he'd said those guys should be shot, but it didn't make it right. It was not. The way to play the game, it was an atrocity. But he and Soldier Weirdo alone would carry the burden of those deaths for the rest of their lives. I didn't blow the whistle. No one blew the whistle. All of us had seen too many atrocities. And what is war anyway, but one big raging atrocity? It was something every doofut, regardless of which side he was on, knew to the bottom of his soul. Both sides had killers and sadists like PFC Charles and George Company, who shot the 2 PS on 6th of February. It wasn't until a month or so after that I realized he was crazy. We'd been walking down a road when we passed an old South Korean man with a long flowing beard. Charles had pulled out his Zippo lighter, grabbed the old man and set fire to his beard. But each side had battlefield pragmatists too. One of the guys in the platoon summed up the most recent incident in his friend Soldier Weirdo's defense with the idiots would kicked off before they got to battalion anyway. The kid just shortened their misery. Soon after this event, Del Evans became the battalion intelligence officer, replaced in the company by a mouse named Captain Pearson. Within a week, Pearson, who wasn't even an infantryman, he was artillery, had virtually destroyed the morale of Company E. It seemed impossible, but it was true. Shave your face, blouse, your trousers, wear your helmet, and all your equipment, he ordered unshaved and stripped down. He had spent the previous year achieving one of the finest fighting records of any company in the U.S. Army. It had been awarded several individual presidential unit citations and had been skippered by Medal of Honor winners Reginald Desiderio, awarded posthumous, and Lewis Millett, as well as DSC winner Phil Gilchrist for Objective Logan and Del Evans. An outfit is only as good as its commander Desiderio Millie Gilchrist, and Evans had made easy the proud effective unit that it was. And now this little mouse was tearing us apart. Morale and fighting spirit plummeted. Hope the bastard doesn't get in front of me during an attack. I might slip and blow his head off, was the old's attitude toward the new Easy Six. Fortunately for them and Captain Pearson, the much-rumoured rotation program, which eventually would make Korea a 1-year tour, had started in April, and everyone was too busy adding up his points and keeping abreast of the changing policy to grease the new old man. After 45 straight days on the line, we were relieved, hooray, it's back to Beers Broads, and the good life shouted Ace Machine Gunner Sovereign as we loaded trucks and headed south, but the trucks didn't take us to the rear. Little did we know we were being shifted from the quiet western sector of the Kuma Valley to the red-hot eastern side. The enemy held the high ground from the towering slopes of Papasan Hill 1062. The Chinese had commanding views of the entire valley, And as well as having such brilliant observation, the enemy also had plenty of indirect mortar and artillery support. The wolfhounds had jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire. The hardest hit by this reality were the high-point rotation guys who had figured they'd never see the front line again. There were no celebrations that day in the land of the morning. Calm that evening, we conducted a night relief without incident, but when the fog lifted in the morning, we found ourselves looking straight into enemy guns on the higher ground across the valley. Fortunately, 3rd Platoon drew the open right flank, which was the farthest away from both the Chinese and Captain Pearson's CP. The first 2 days we followed the schedule of the relieved unit so the Chinese wouldn't get wind of the switch. Until we were set, we stayed in our holes and dug even deeper just at dusk. On the second day, the Chinese clobbered the company front with a stiff barrage of mortar fire. This was followed by a PA announcement from the Chinese trenches. "Welcome, wolfhounds, we kill all of you so much for military security and our clandestine relief." This message was repeated over and over until a crazy little Hawaiian in my platoon, Takashi Maki, jumped out of his hole, stood in the open and screamed back, "Damn you, Chinamen, damn you, come and get us, you lousy sons of... ___." Chinese psychological warfare couldn't faze a Hawaiian, especially the likes of Maki who attacked up hills shouting "Yay wolfhounds." I did love those Hawaiians, and after 8 months of being knee in little Buddha heads, I'd kind of become one. I spoke pidgin, "Hey man, me go down company CP and get order." Okay, brass scooped PO with my fingers, and with them waited with great anticipation for the next care package of abalone and other island goodies. When Dell had found out how much I respected the Hawaiians, he'd gone out of his way to assign as many as he could to 3rd Platoon, and when the fighting was, we all got along fine. But when the war became static and boring, and with the arrival of the Pearson types, the island boys were a wild bunch to control. I was constantly in hot water because of their shenanigans. Now Pearson called on the sound power from his CP, demanding the name and platoon of the soldier who had yelled back at the Chinese. He didn't get it. We hadn't heard a thing down at Battalion Intelligence Officer Del Evans needed a prisoner. AP could tell him who we faced on Hill 1062 and what their intentions were. It was only natural for him to call on his old comrades for help. "Hack, you should conduct this raid. If you volunteer, I'll fix it, so the operation comes directly under battalion control. You can plan it yourself however you want, and I'll get your platoon off the line for a few days to get ready, bored with just sitting there day after day on the receiving end of Chinese incoming, and with the assurance that 3rd Platoon would get a break and Pearson would not be involved." I said yes, we were moved off the line and were given 3 days to plan, rehearse and execute the raid. We set up at EOM supply trains. It was the first time 3rd Platoon had been off the line in more than 2 months, and immediately one of our CEers went out to get some steaks, while the other guys cleaned up and rested Dell a few key leaders, and I planned the operation in detail. What we devised was simple, bold, and maximized shock and surprise. I decided on a lightning tank infantry daylight strike that would put us into the Chinese positions before they knew what hit them. Shock action, and speed would be the key to the Chinese's front door, similar to the way Captain Michele had zoomed through Swan in January. We'd go with a stripped-down platoon, only rifles, bars, and fighters the heavier stuff, and the timid could stay home. The surprise would come from our daring. No one in his right mind would ever attack a Chinese main battle position of at least a couple of regiments with 1 platoon in broad daylight, and our timing we jump off at 1700, which was unheard of the Americans. And surprise was ours. We dismounted the tanks and rushed to the base of the hill and stopped. I could not believe what my eyes were telling my head. The gradual slope we'd expected from the map was absolutely vertical. The best laid plans of mice and men and one goddamn Chinese sentry, or thought you can read all kinds of books you want and you can make all kinds of plans you want, Steve Preener had said. But when you get out in the field, those books and those plans might not meet the eye of the situation you find there, so you just have to roll with it. Right, Steve, let's roll, I thought. As I slung my M1 across my back and started climbing hand over hand straight up, my guys followed. No orders were given. The men in the 3rd Platoon were a magnificent team. They'd stayed loose, flexible, and above all, cool. Meanwhile, the tanks had pulled back off the road and joined the tracks in the cleared lane through the open rice paddy east of the road together. They were laying down welcome murderous overhead support fire. When I got to the top, I jumped into a trench almost on top of 2 enemy soldiers. I shot them both, then started blasting stunned Chinamen on my left and right. Meanwhile, my guys poured into the trench. We fanned out through the intricate Mazika trench system, knocking the Chinese defenders off. As we went, when we crested the ridge, we looked down onto the enemy's main battle positions. They were manned only by a light security force, but behind the main positions in a deep draw was what looked like a complete rifle company they'd been eating. Now they scurried for cover while our point-blank plunging fire took a heavy toll. Our artillery was still slamming in. We were now in complete control of the ridge and had captured 3 prisoners. It was time to withdraw. We quickly slid back the way we had come, while the tanks returned to the base of the hill to pick us up. I sent the wounded down first with 2 squads and the prisoners, and stayed with a couple men to hold the Chinese positions until the WIA were loaded and our task force ready to split artillery, quad 50, and tank fire kept the stunned Chinese at bay. When we too finally slid down the hill after I'd given the order to withdraw, one of the tracks had panicked left the cleared lane in the race. Patty and hit a mine. Now the disabled vehicle was sitting right across the lane itself, blocking our only escape through the minefield. Meanwhile, the Chinese were getting themselves together. They started putting down a lot of fire, small arms mortar artillery and SP. As yet they didn't have our range, but even with their lousy combo it wouldn't take long. There was only one alternative. I shouted to the tank platoon leader, "Let's try 1 tank over that bridge, and if the son of a __ holds, we'll go out that way." The 36-ton Sherman gingerly rolled across the CMIC, collapsed. The bridge sagged, swayed, but held. I radioed the crew of the damaged track to abandon their vehicle load on other tracks and follow the lead Sherman's trail to get the hell out of there. Once my own tank had crossed the bridge, I ordered the tank platoon leader to fire a couple of armor-piercing rounds into the disabled track. No way was I going to have those 450 calibers dismounted by the enemy and remounted on the hill facing my platoon. The rounds split the thin-skinned vehicle in half, and it burst into flames. We made it back 16 wounded and nobody badly hurt. No friendly dead, and 3 prisoners. Not a bad show. I got off my tank and was making sure our wounded were being looked after when a lieutenant colonel raced up, bellowing like a bull, "Who's in charge here?" "I am, sir, Second Lieutenant Hackworth, and who gave the order for destroying my track." "I did, sir. Well, I'm going to have you pay for it. That's $120,000. You do not have the authority to destroy my vehicles." Lieutenant Colonel Henry Coe of the 21st AA Battalion raged on chewing my arse for not going into the minefield with a tank and winching his damn track out. I tried to explain that it was so hot out there that no infantry soldier would have lived, that we'd barely gotten his crew out alive. He did not want to hear. Finally, I got pissed off, very pissed off. I told him that no way was I going to risk 1 infantryman for a rotten piece of twisted steel, that my people's lives were more important than his goddamn clapped-out track, and that if I had to make the same decision again, I would do it in spades. Colonel Henry was livid. "You will pay for this," he screamed. A jeep screeched up and out of it, jumped my regimental commander, Colonel George B. Sloan, the divisional commander, Major General Ira P. Swift, and the Corps Commander Major General John I.R. and Mike O'Daniel, all 3 great combat leaders of World War II. General O'Daniel boomed out, "Where is the platoon leader?" Oh no, I really must be in trouble now, I thought. "Sir, Second Lieutenant Hackworth," I reported. "Second Lieutenant, you are a First Lieutenant as of now," and O'Daniel said, thumping a silver star on my chest. "I'm also recommending you for the Distinguished Service Cross. I watched the complete attack from the regimental op, and it was outstanding, outstanding. It was one of the finest demonstrations of professionalism and leadership I have seen in combat. Your platoon operated as a perfect military force. I want you to tell me which soldiers you want me to decorate all of them, sir," I said, and right then and there every man of my platoon who went on that raid was given a bronze or silver star by this fine fighting corps commander. Sometime during my chat with General O'Daniel, the outraged Colonel Henry crawled away, and I heard nothing else about his precious track Moore and Moe. I was seeing officers like him, ones whose priorities were to my mind anyway, 180 degrees out. This guy happened to be insanely obsessed with his machine. Others like Captain Pearson, and the guys who replaced Colonel Murch as 2nd Battalion CE seemed unskilled in their trade, and didn't understand or even try to understand what made combat men tick by the time of this raid. I'd had a gut full of all of them, and I'd really enjoyed the opportunity to organize and execute my own plans for this mission. It had been great not to have to bow to the demands of men who didn't know what they were talking about to begin with. So when soon after the 8th of August, Mission Colonel Sloan offered me a volunteer unit, a completely independent command, a unit that I could handpick, organize and train as I saw fit, it was difficult to refuse. I told the guys in my platoon, "We're going with you," they said, and a fair number of them did. I talked to Schroeder and Crispino, who were both still over in G Company, rod on that hack. "I'm on my way," Chris said. But good, steady old Schroers, who'd been with the 3rd of G since long before the war, and by now was the only original member left, decided to stick with George. Chris brought a bunch of my old platoon with him, though, and along with the easy guys, they provided a cadre of men whom I knew and trusted, who knew me and my style of leadership, and who in their individual ways would give shape to the unit we soon would create the 27th Wolfhound Raiders for.